Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about the Grand Slam. One of my pet peeves in tennis is when people say that Novak Djokovic won his 8th Grand Slam title or Serena Williams won her 20th Grand Slam title. No, Serena Williams won her 20th major title. Novak Djokovic won his 8th major title. The only person who has won multiple Grand Slams is Rod Laver. He won it in 1962 and 1969. So Grand Slam means all 4 major championships in a calendar year. When a baseball player hits a Grand Slam, it means they hit a home run with 4 guys or 3 guys on base scoring 4 runs. Not every home run is a Grand Slam. So that's one of my pet peeves. But it's interesting to look back at the history of the Grand Slam and how the wordage came about. But for starters, only 5 players have won Grand Slams in singles, starting with Don Budge in 1938, and then Maureen Connolly in 1953, and then Rod Laver in 1962, and then Rod Laver again in 1969, then Margaret Court in 1970, and Steffi Graf in 1988. But the wordage for Grand Slam first came about in golf, actually, in 1930. It came from the game of bridge, where if you turn all your tricks in one hand, it was called a Grand Slam. I don't play bridge, so I guess I'm going to have to take the word for it. But that's what I read, is where it came from. So the first time that Grand Slam was actually used was in conjunction with golf, when Bobby Jones won the Grand Slam of golf at the time, which was consisting of the Open Championship, the British Amateur, the U.S. Open, and the U.S. Amateur. And when Bobby Jones won the U.S. Amateur in September of 1930 at Merion Cricket Club, O.B. Keller, who was the Atlanta Journal golf writer, who was writing a lot about Bobby Jones, who was from Georgia, O.B. Keller first coined the term Grand Slam. Now there was another writer, George Trevor, with the New York Sun, who called Bobby Jones' accomplishment the impregnable quadrilateral, and that didn't really catch on. So the Grand Slam was what it was called. In tennis, 3 years later, in 1933, an Australian named Jack Crawford won the first 3 majors of the year: the Australian Open, Australian Championships, the French Championships, Wimbledon, and was going into the U.S. Championships looking to sweep all 4. And John Kiernan with the New York Times was credited with using the term Grand Slam in tennis 3 years after Mr. Keller used it in golf. And also Alison Danzig, the New York Times tennis writer, talked about how Crawford failed in his attempt to win the Grand Slam. Crawford lost in the finals of the U.S. Championships to Fred Perry. Interesting, Bud Collins, in his Bud Collins History of Tennis book, which is right here, which every tennis fan should have, he talks about a reporter named Alan Gould with the Reading Eagle in Pennsylvania, who a month and a half before Mr. Kiernan and Mr. Danzig referred to the Grand Slam in tennis, that Mr. Gould referred to it first. So since the Reading Eagle was not as prestigious as the New York Times got more of the credit for that. But when Don Budge became the first tennis player to win the Grand Slam in 1938, there was no reference at all to him winning the Grand Slam, just that he had won, all the major tournaments of the year. He talks about it in his biography, or his autobiography, on how nobody referred to it as the Grand Slam. And when Maureen Connolly also won it in 1953, also they didn't mention that she had won the Grand Slam, but saying that she'd won all the major titles, but they pointed out that she'd lost the Italian Championships final. So that's quite interesting. Now, in 1960, in golf, Arnold Palmer was the sensation at the time, and he had won the Masters and the U.S. Open. The Masters had become the prestigious tournament that it is today. It became golf had a professional Grand Slam now that consisted of the Masters, the U.S. Open, the Open Championship, and then also the PGA, since the Bobby Jones era was more the amateur game. Golf was now in the pro stage, and those were the four legs of the Grand Slam of what everyone recognized in the pro game. And Bob Drum, who was a golf writer for the Pittsburgh Press, he and Arnold Palmer were discussing about the modern Grand Slam, and it was actually Bob Drum who talked about how after Arnold Palmer had won the 1960 U.S. Open, that he had won the first two legs of the pro modern Grand Slam of golf. So that's where that language started to resurface as far as the Grand Slam. Now, 2 years later, Arnold Palmer actually did not win the Open Championship and the PGA, so that's where that story ended. But then in 1962, Rod Laver won the Grand Slam in tennis, the first of his two Grand Slams. And in those news reports, you can hear media mention that Rod Laver had won the first Grand Slam by a man since Don Budge in 1938. So beginning with Rod Laver's Grand Slam in 1962, that's where you start seeing the language of Grand Slam being used. Also famously in 1969, when Laver won it again in the pro era in 1969, Laver and Hall of Famer Bud Collins talk about the 1960 Grand Slam in this book, The Education of a Tennis Player, which is also a great read. And then, of course, you have Margaret Court in 1970 and Steffi Graf in 1988. So that's a little conversation about the Grand Slam, and we'll see if someone else will be able to turn the trick and win the Grand Slam, or the impregnable quadrilateral, as it was once referred to in golf. But anyway, that's all for the Grand Slam, and take care, everybody.